Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's Real Training for Free. Nick Cavalancia here, sitting in for Randy Franklin Smith. I think you're in for a real treat. This is one of those really interesting topics. I think have never had a topic quite like this, where you have a vendor that had actual interaction with a live incident and had to help them respond. Typically we read about it, we see it in either news articles or maybe in a report, and you're sort of seeing the sanitized version of, here's what we found and here's what we did. And it's all, in this case, it's sort of live and raw. And you get to kind of have a chance to walk through this. And we're utilizing Scattered Spider. And if you haven't been hiding under a rock, you already know they're the ones that hit MGM and Caesars in Vegas. I was about to say London. That was weird. Las Vegas instead, because they're definitely not in London. And just to kind of talk a little bit about the attack that they had and what they saw, and kind of walk you through in hopefully some gross detail, so you get a real chance to see what an attack looks like, specifically from an identity perspective, but from a couple other perspectives throughout the attack as well. So super excited. Like I said, I don't think we've ever done one quite like this. We've certainly talked about attacks and what steps they take, but not from the perspective of, well, this is what I saw next and this is what I did next. That's very new. So we're hoping this will be a lot of fun. Be sure to make sure you ask a lot of questions today. Today's Real Training for Free is made possible by the good folks over at Silverfort. And we do have two great speakers today. You've heard them both before if you've been on any of our webcasts. We have Yiftach Keshet. He's VP of Product Marketing at Silverfort. Yiftach, thanks for joining me.
Hi, thanks, Nick. Pleasure to be here as always.
Glad you're here. And Yaron Kassner. He's CTO and co-founder of Silverfort. Yes, Yaron, thank you for joining me.
Yeah, glad to be here.
Yeah, glad you're both here. And so what we're going to do here, as always, we've got a little bit of some slides that I'm going to show first. The housekeeping items we, of course, have to go through before we get started. We are recording today's webinar. So if you want to take a look at this later on, maybe you have to leave early, you want to watch the rest of the recording, want to pass it off to a colleague, et cetera, et cetera. I always laugh whenever people say in emails like, do you want to pass it off to a colleague or a family member? It's like, your mom doesn't want to watch this thing. There's no way. So anyways, a colleague, we know that's at least. You'll be sent a link to the recording via email in a day or two. And then, as always, I have the Q&A box open. And we would love for you to, if you've got a question, a comment, an anecdote, I mean, anything you care to share, stick it in the Q&A box. And we're going to try to interject that commentary and those questions throughout the webcast. I tend to feel that questions are far better answered when they're asked contextually, because obviously in some cases you're asking a question like, how'd you get that? And then if we answer that question 40 minutes later, we're not going to exactly know what it was you were referring to. But if we do it contextually, it's pretty easy. So I will have this box up here in front of me at all times here. So feel free to pop something in there as we're going through. And you never know, we might even ask all of you guys an off-the-cuff question anyways, just to sort of do an informal poll about something that we're talking about. So let's jump in here. What I'm going to do is kind of set the stage for the attack a little bit by talking about first some of the history of Scattered Spider. It's not actually a long history, it's only about a year and change, but just kind of walk through this and then talk about the modes of operation that they use, and then just align this up with MITRE, as I love to do, just so you can see where in MITRE these particular the threat actions exist within the MITRE attack framework. And so and as I'm doing this, Yaron, Yiftach, if you guys have any commentary, a question, a thought, something you want to pipe in, I mean, by all means, feel free to interrupt me. I would love to have you guys interject if there's any color you can add to the slides. Does that sound good?
Sounds great.
Perfect, perfect. So we'll start with just the history of Scattered Spider. If you look at the top and the bottom being, of course, kind of like today, if you will, you see that we only are lasting, it's about a year and almost a year and a half. Something like that. And originally, when Scattered Spider came out, it was an unknown threat vendor, so it was just given a UNC value of 3944. There were some indications based on some of the code that was called Roasted Octopus, and I believe that O in Octopus is supposed to be a 0, I think. But anyways, doesn't really matter. And so they start off as a threat group. You can see as we kind of walk down this, for about the first 6 months, they targeted telecom companies and mobile carriers. And initially, it just seemed like, that's who they chose to pick. That's the vertical. But what ends up happening is, as you start seeing what they're doing over time, this is actually more of a very concerted effort to gain access, because later on, they're going to be doing a ton of SIM swapping type attacks. And so there's a need there to have access to a bunch of mobile carriers or telecom companies, et cetera. So this was pretty well thought out. This was not just like, let's pick that industry because nobody's really attacking it. It's more like we're going to start there, and then as we grow and we expand our operations, we will have our foot in the door of these organizations and can do things with their networks if we choose to do so. And in January of this year, they started actually deploying out a ton of phishing pages. So this was the next step that they did, was trying to put out a bunch of phishing pages that were going to be used to garner credentials. Again, very well thought out. So first we get ourselves access to mobile carriers for SIM swapping, which we'll do later on. Then we put out a bunch of phishing pages that are there impersonating different brands. CrowdStrike in their threat report for this year dubbed them Scattered Spider, and the name usually sticks because they're pretty good at just coming up with really creative names for whatever reason. So that name is primarily what they've been referred to as. And then they kept attacking organizations. You see up in the third line down, hitting tech and gaming and some other industries. They start expanding. They did something kind of interesting in May, where they started utilizing Azure VMs and a particular piece of software, and the name's escaping me for the sake of argument here today, but to actually lateral move between Azure VMs. So same kind of lateral movement we'd see in an on-premises network, but doing it up in the cloud. And they also shifted their tactics now to using ransomware. And when I look at this initially, when I first read they shift to include the use of ransomware, it's like, nah, that wasn't a shift. Like they went, the initial thing's not working. I think this is far more of a concerted effort, a very targeted effort of we're gonna test the waters. We're gonna see if we can get to mobile carriers. We're gonna see if we can get into organizations. Can we lateral move in the cloud? They're doing all these things to kind of, they can make some money along the way, but I think they're really testing the water to see what can we accomplish. And then they start including ransomware in the attacks. And then I did want to mention, you see in June, this idea of muddled Libra. It's another thinking it's another threat group, at least another piece of software. It's considered a subset. Unit 42 thinks it's a subset of Scattered Spider, so it might be people, or it might be a using of code or something. But there's already a breakoff of Scattered Spider, and if you remember, a couple of years back, we saw a number of threat groups that were growing one off the other, as if people were sort of just shifting between organizations like people do in any industry. They go from one company to another, and they're doing the same thing here. And of course, the MGM and Caesars ransomware attack. And then towards the end of this year, last month, CISA put out an advisory with the FBI where they're listing out kind of everything that this group does, the MITRE ATT&CK framework types of activities that are being used. I mean, everything there. The U.S. government's now paying attention clearly to these folks, despite that there's been no arrests. Yiftach, Yaron, any other kind of notable spots in here, but even if you don't have the time frame, but anything else we'd add to sort of this ever-growing, it's sort of an impressive CV of them doing one thing and the next thing and the next thing, where it just adds up to like, we get to attack MGM and Caesars, which cost something like $100 million.
I guess, well, most of the cool stuff that we have to say are about the lateral movement part, and we don't want to do any spoilers. But I will say that I think what characterizes Scattered Spider versus other attacking groups is that traditionally, initial access is usually obtained by the traditional spear phishing, sending a weaponized email, getting a foothold through the malware vector, if you will. I think Scattered Spider are noted for employing compromised credentials from the very first stage of the initial access. Okay, exactly as you said, phishing pages, text. They seem to take fond of this as an initial access vector, which does make you wonder whether other threat actors will start shifting this way as well.
Yeah, what's very interesting, I'm going to jump to the next slide because I want to talk a little bit more about that. But again, I'm keeping this, for those of you listening, keeping this very high level because I don't want to spoil the stuff that Yiftach and Yaron are going to cover. And so I do want to talk about this from kind of three perspectives. The first one is initial access. And if you look here, you do hear some of the things that Yiftach mentioned, like phishing and smishing. But you look at the last two. and you start seeing, MFA push bombing. We've done a webcast on that. If you're not familiar with that, that is when organizations have employed an MFA app that doesn't require you to like get the code off the app and type it in somewhere, but instead it just says like, was this you? If it was, press this button. You know, it's a push notification, and all you have to do as the user, or excuse me, the owner of the credential, is just press the button, and then you're telling the system with a second form of authentication, that being something you have, that's the phone. You would identify that's me, but the push bombing happens at 3 in the morning while you're sleeping. It happens again and again and again, despite how many times you say no, and again and again and again, and you're like, oh my gosh, shut up, and you just think it's a mistake or something's wrong, and you hit yes, it's me, and that's how they get in. That's push bombing. All right, so there's that aspect, but that actually denotes something that Yiftach was kind of hinting at, which is this: they're going towards credentials, and they know if they're going for credentials, more and more organizations are leveraging multi-factor authentication, so they have to employ other means of doing this. One is the push bombing. That's for those that have those types of apps. And then for the other folks who maybe just get a text message, that's where the SIM swapping comes in, and that's where, going back to the very early months of their existence, attacking telecom companies comes into play. And so they will do that, and then what they'll do is they will go and utilize social engineering methods where they will try and hit the help desk, going, once they've done, let's say, a SIM swap, going, I'm having a problem, and they've actually identified a very specific user, it's probably someone they've compromised, and I'm trying to get my MFA working, it's not working, can we do a reset? I've got the phone, and blah, 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 that kind of thing, in order to either get a new MFA token issued or to bypass it entirely, but something like that. And that's actually what started the MGM attack, was exactly this type of methodology. Getting some credentials, going to the help desk, social engineering the help desk tech people, and then gaining access. Yiftach, anything else you want to add here, just because you were kind of right around this area when you were talking, or should I keep going? And I don't want you have to spoil your portion of the presentation just yet.
No, keep going. Feel free.
Very good, very good. I figured as much. Just want to make sure. The next part is the idea around the execution, the persistence, and privilege escalation. And so by doing that social engineering, they are able to register their own MFA tokens on the stolen phone. They often will go through, and because if there's, let's say, some kind of identity provider like Okta has been involved at one attack or another, they will go and establish a federated identity that has access to this account. And the reason for that is then they no longer have to have the password or the MFA token for the originally compromised account. There's now a federated identity that's also trusted, that they have control over and can gain access. It's much like the OAuth access that you've seen, if you've seen where threat actors get access to a mailbox within Exchange Online by providing OAuth access, which is what you would do if you're using, let's say, Outlook on your phone. It basically is telling Outlook, the Exchange Online, hey, this app should have access to this mailbox. And then you go, yup. And as soon as you do that, it doesn't matter if you change your password, because the app is being given access to the mailbox, not the user account. Same concept here. The federated identity has been given access to the user account, no longer need to be logging in as that user account anymore. And then they also have been known for taking advantage of endpoint detection and response solutions, and leveraging remote shell capabilities within them, and then even deploying RMM solutions, just basically to allow themselves access back to this system again. And then some other things in sort of the area of discovery, lateral movement, and exfiltration is they use lots of legitimate tools, so plenty of living off the land. They do a ton of discovery, and it's not just trying to find like where data is. They are trying to find everything from virtual environments, going through where backups exist. They're looking where credential stores might exist, like a PAM solution. They'll look for not tokens, I'm going blank here, keys, like private keys. I mean, they're going for everything they can get that's going to provide them access. This is just very, very invasive and very, very detailed. Then on the idea of wanting to laterally move, they obviously have to have credentials. So they do enumeration of Active Directory. They do they take over AWS inventory, and they make sure they can figure out what local and cloud-based environment or systems are there, so they can laterally move. And then even using their own extraction, transport, and load tools to take data that they've got across multiple locations within an organization. So let's say some are up in the cloud AWS, and some are on premises in this location, and some are on premises in that location. and they bring all that data centrally back to one location within the org in a compromised system, and then take it out. And that way there's less indicators of compromise, because if you did it from each of those locations, let's say 6 of them, you have six filtrations going on, it's going to be kind of tough to hide all that, but maybe you could hide one is the idea. So there's a lot of thought that goes into this particular attack by Scattered Spider, really kind of impressive on its own. And the last thing that I want to cover, and it's a couple of slides here, is I want to talk about where Scattered Spider appears in the MITRE attack framework. It does say Scattered Spider in MITRE. Yes, I know that rhymes all the time. I'm a poet and don't know it, but I'll leave that alone anyways. That's as much humor as you get from me today. We'll start over here with reconnaissance and resource development. And just a couple of things kind of come into play here that I think are kind of interesting here is the like the establishing of accounts that's over there on the lower right of the 4 highlighted areas here. They'll actually make social media accounts with what's called backstopping fake accounts. So they create a fake account, let's say an Active Directory, they will make an account for it in social media. So in case somebody goes and looks online, is this even an employee here? And they'll have a fake account there, so it makes it look like somebody actually exists as in the organization, so it looks like a real organization member. And so that's sort of really sneaky. I could even see them doing it like on LinkedIn even. I mean, you can say you work for any company you want, whether or not someone allows you to say their company, but you could put I work for, and put the company name, whether it's the exact same one or not is a whole different question here. So they're doing a ton of reconnaissance to try to figure out who they should be attacking. The acquiring the infrastructure has a lot to do with the idea of, for example, of where they go through and figure out all the infrastructure within AWS. But and the gathering the victim identity information and the phishing for information, those things are all about trying to figure out who we want to target and whether they're going to spearfish or just regular fish, but they're trying to figure out who within the organization they're trying to get access to. We slide on over to where they want to get initial access, and there's quite a few threat actions here. Some ones of note. With phishing, it could be email, it could be mobile. They do a lot of mobile phishing because the defenses are down typically because we consume so much content and we're clicking on things and we don't think about it in the same vein that we do when we're on a traditional computer, whether it's desktop or laptop. And then also that's also how they start and initiate the SIM swaps is utilizing, especially if it's Android, they will utilize vulnerabilities and be able to take over and create a SIM swap right there and then. And on the trusted relationships that are down in the lower left, they are in a lot of cases targeting contracted IT help desks. So there's a degree of separation that exists from, well, I know John, he literally down the hall from me. You know, that doesn't exist anymore because it's a contracted IT department. That's part of some of also their gathering of information that exists here. On the trusted relationship as well, that is where they will do the thing with the federated access. They're leveraging a trusted relationship there as well. And then the other thing that's sort of interesting here is the serverless execution kind of in the middle here is that use of the extract, transport, load tools that they do. They use that so they can, without having to leverage you know, like your own, one of your servers. Obviously they have ETLs running on a server, but meaning they're not leveraging your server's own, let's say doing a UNC path to another location or something like that, utilizing their own tools, but they're considering that serverless execution because they're just using their own tool to centralize the data here. And I mean, obviously there's a lot more that go into here with the external remote services. That goes back to like utilizing the endpoint detection and response or the RMM solutions and leveraging those for initial access. So lots going on here. And if I move over to privilege escalation, defense evasion, and credential access, quite a few here as well. A couple that I want to cover here. It starts with account manipulation, upper left. In this case, that's where they are doing those temporary federated credentials so they can hide which credential is actually compromised. And that's actually quite brilliant if you think about it, because once they've reset the password to the original account that was quote unquote compromised, because there's a federated credential associated with it and no one's looking for that, they think, okay, that account's no longer compromised. Nudge, nudge, wink, wink. I mean, they don't know that it is. So that's kind of a brilliant access there. The domain policy modification is the idea of trusting the federated ID provider. The middle bottom under defense evasion, under impersonation, they will, again, they try to pretend that they're calling a help desk, pretending to be employees. So that's the impersonation that happens there as well. A couple other ones here over on the right that are worth mentioning. The multi-factor authentication request generation is the prompt bombing that I talked about. And that's actually something new. This is one of the new entries that's in version 14 of the MITRE ATT&CK framework. And oh, interesting. So Caleb says this goes back to us talking about the account manipulation where they're creating the temporary federated credentials. Caleb mentions that the user agent is a high fidelity indicator for multi-factor that's modified. So that actually helps. It's something that if we had a solution here that was looking down at that particular level of detail. In fact, we showed some of this, I think, in one of our previous, just recently. It might have even been Yiftach showing this, but that it was another vendor, I'm not sure which, but we were talking about the user agents that were used in an MFA request. And then another one here that's interesting is down at the bottom right is the stealing web session cookies. And they use those as another means of leveraging browser cookies to get access to something. So they're trying every single possible way they can to get credentials access. It's not just, oh, we broke into one system and we did Mimikatz like normal and we scraped RAM and we got an admin account and we jumped and we used RDP. And these guys are going after every single thing. They have thought everything through. And then the last one at the bottom is unsecured credentials. And this is just sort of an interesting thing. This sort of fits into like discovery, but this is the use of it. But I think of this more under the light of discovery. They're looking for credentials that are stored on like insecurely on someone's system, sort of like the digital version of a Post-it note on your monitor. So looking for files that might have a password in it, looking in the registry if there's a password or set of credentials in it. They'll also look for private keys that are stored insecurely on a victim system. So they're just trying every single possible way to find credentials, and then of course, as it's implied here at the bottom of this particular section of MITRE, use those credentials. And then is it the last part? I've got two more slides here. For discovery, lateral movement, and collection, a lot of this just sort of makes sense if you look through these and you go, the account discovery, okay, they're trying to discover accounts. It's both local and an AD, as well as in the cloud. But some of the things I thought were sort of interesting is like the cloud service dashboard. That's where they leverage AWS's systems manager inventory. So they're going through that platform, and I believe that one's also new for version 14 of the ATT&CK framework. They just came out with it in October, so it's really, really new. Also, under lateral movement with remote services, utilizing the cloud services for lateral movement. That's not new for MITRE, but that's sort of new to be seen where they're utilizing those as well. And then the other thing is the middle right, data from information repositories. They are looking specifically in code repositories and SharePoint specifically. And they've been noted to do that over and over and over again. So they're not just looking at, let's say, file systems or looking in NAS or SAN devices. They're looking in very specific things they think they're going to find information within. And then the last slide that I've got here on MITRE is the idea around just around command and control, exfiltration, and impact. Got a couple of those here. And in this case, if you look at, like, for example, the exfiltration over a web service that's leveraging the data that they might get from AWS, they have been known, as we mentioned, to start utilizing ransomware. So you see in the upper right, data encrypted for impact. The Ingress tool transfer that's there, they actually will download some of their own tools at the very beginning of their attacks as well. So that happens. And then the exfiltration, the protocol tunneling is sort of largely kind of around their ETL process that they have as well. Yiftach, Yaron, anything that I sort of maybe missed or something that you think is interesting on any of these slides? I'm happy to even go backwards. Just anything that you'd add to this from a MITRE perspective, or that is sort of interesting or unique about their attacks.
Yeah. Maybe I'll just say that I think what's interesting about the approach is that if you look at it, almost all these boxes, all the techniques that they're using, and you try to find a similarity, what they're doing is basically stealing credentials, then using them to access every possible interface possible. And that's where they're smart. They didn't invent a new capability or a new, a new smart way to didn't find a new vulnerability or a new exploit. What they did was just utilize the credentials in a very smart way. So I think the cloud aspect is really interesting. The fact that, okay, they get credentials for accessing a cloud console. Then from the cloud console, suddenly they can jump into machines that are hosted on the cloud. They don't even need to have a network connectivity to them. They just use the cloud credentials to access them directly from the cloud. So they're taking all these shortcuts, get wherever they need, and all they need to do all this is just the right credentials.
And on that note, Yiftach, you want to go as well? Sorry.
Yeah, so I don't know exactly how to map it to the MITRE framework, but what's also interesting about them that it's been seen in told in various reports that they also hijack the internal communication in their victims to try to tap into the channels of the instant response. So if there's a Slack channel in which the security team discuss,
hey,
what will you do now? So I think it might fall under defense evasion. I don't know if it's like sort of tapping into the responder's channel and take actions accordingly. This is, and by the way,
I remember reading that. I did forget to add that in. I'm glad you brought that up because I thought that was interesting as well. They will even monitor Exchange as well. And the intent there was just to see if there is anyone saying, "Hey, I think we've been hacked," or what. So they're kind of, they're putting themselves a drone up in the air so they can see what's going around them, as opposed to just knowing where they're doing. They're trying to see if anyone's coming for them, and that's kind of really brilliant. I don't think I have that one marked in here at all, but you're 100% correct, and I love that one. So let's do this. On Yaron's note of it a lot has so much to do with credentials. I hope all of you can appreciate, if you have no credentials, you have no access to anything, cloud, on premises, or otherwise. And so this is probably one of the reasons why the folks at Silverfort were contacted in order to try and help respond to a threat, because it always involves authentication and credentials. So Yiftach and Yaron, they're going to show a little bit about their first-hand experience about building this in progress, live, in real-time response playbook they had to build while they were dealing with a customer's issue with them. So with that, Yiftach, I'm going to go ahead and give you control, and I will. I'm going to make you presenter. I'll let you know when I can see your screen. And for those of you that are watching, if you have questions, again, I have the Q&A box up here. So if you have a question, feel free to ask. And Yiftach and Yaron, if it's okay, I may actually interject here or there, or try not to interrupt you, but I'll try to squeeze in between statements if there's a question that has come in. And we can make this as interesting a presentation as is possible. Does that
sounds great?
Okay, cool. So just to validate. So Nick, you can see my screen, you can hear us?
I can hear you. Yeah, you're good. I'm sorry, that was me. For some reason, my audio just went out for like half a second. I can hear you and I can see your screen. You're all good to go. The floor is yours.
Okay, great. I think I've done so many webinars, and still there's this moment of dread when you pass control from one to the other. It always seems like a miracle that it actually works. So, yeah. So hi everybody again. Thanks, Nick, for this really thorough and fundamental review on Scattered Spider. There's tons to talk about on the initial access and various. What we will focus on is the lateral movement aspect. Again, us being an identity protection company, this is sort of our domain expertise and what interests us most. So we'll talk about a bit. We'll zoom in a bit into Scattered Spider, the lateral movement aspect. We'll talk in general about the instant response challenges that are entailed in the identity, in the identity aspect. We know, and as opposed, for example, to the network or the endpoint or the malware or other more established instant response fields. Then we'll understand, we'll break down the identity attack surface. Then we'll go to the case study. Even though in these bullets, it seems like the case study is just 25%. In practice, I assure you, it'll be more than like 60, 70% of what we'll present. And definitely, Nick and all the audience, I do urge you to ask questions. As we say, I totally agree with Nick that it's much more, it's so much more interesting when the conversation is alive instead of stashing everything to the, I don't know, to the cemetery of the 5 last minutes of the webinar. So definitely feel free to do that. So let's start. Just really short recap, just to make sure we understand, and it's important. Lateral movement takes place over compromised credentials, right? We have an attacker established a foothold. We're talking about this post initial access, post initial compromise. Then the access takes place through the legitimate identity infrastructure. This is extremely important, okay? Doesn't matter if it's in the cloud, if it's on-prem. When you're using credentials, whether you are a legitimate user or the attacker, when you authenticate, you are involving the infrastructure. If it's a SaaS app, it will be Azure AD or Okta or Ping. If it's on-prem, probably will be Active Directory. If you're an extremely unfortunate individual, it might be, I don't know, Oracle or some other legacy nightmare that you can have down there. But you always have the identity infrastructure, okay? And then through this, you will access and compromise the assets, whether again on-prem, cloud, or SaaS. And Nick, you definitely touched about that. And this is one of the special traits about Scared Spider, is that they're the great democratizers, right? Once upon a time, lateral movement was on-prem only. Came Scared Spider and said, well, no, equal right for all. It's not fair to say that we cannot differentiate between the on-prem and the SaaS. All are entitled. All are similarly entitled for us to compromise them and break them to pieces. So another interesting thing that I want to point out, because it also relates to Scared Spider. So there's lateral movement, right? And as the term implies, it's lateral. Okay, it moves from it's an east-west movement, and it's somewhat carries an opportunistic character, right? I mean, the attacker has landed on a certain machine at the initial access, and now he's jumping to the machine that appears to provide the most value, and then he'll hop from one machine to the other, extracting data on its way. Okay, while each machine is the stepping stone to the next one. Okay, and it's silent, it's hard to detect, but it's slow, right? And it would not necessarily give you direct access to where, as an attacker, you want to go. Versus that, again, and we'll soon see how Scared Spider do that, both in theory and in our case study. There is the concept of compromising the infrastructure itself. Okay, this is really different. When I take hold of the identity infrastructure, whether it's a PAM or a DC, or the cloud identity provider, or the federation server, Nick, as you pointed out, from that point on, I'm accessing resource, but actually it's not lateral anymore. Okay, I own a single source, fountainhead of attacks, and I can just spread simultaneously to any number of resources that I want. And this is, in a way, and I think what really identifies Scared Spider is that they sort of, well, it said, at least based on the media, Scared Spider are a bunch of European American at their 20s. Okay, for my age of 47 years, it seems like they belong to the generation that don't have any patience anymore. So it's like they don't have the patience to do good old school lateral movement from machine to machine. They just want to take all at once as soon as possible. Boy, this young generation is really, everything's really going downhill. So what is the anatomy? Okay, what is the anatomy of the enterprises today versus what we had a decade ago that actually enables Scared Spider to do what they're doing? So this is a very simplified architecture, right? We have the on-prem with probably domain controller, also a PAM maybe, that is, and we have databases, servers, workstations. We have the IS, right? The machines, the VMs, what we call the cloud workloads. Usually it will be managed by Azure or Amazon or any other providers. And we also have the SaaS. Okay, now the SaaS and the IS both reside on the cloud, but in essence, they're two different things. Now, the blessing and the curse is that these environments are actually are not siloed, they're actually interconnected. They're interconnected in the sense that as a user, I can access with the same username and credential across all of them. Problem is that these type of connections that can arouse from a workstation to a VM through the browser, from between the workload infrastructure and the site identity provider, from the PAM to the VM, these are very complex. They're hard to monitor. And in that sense, it makes them very easily, they can be easily converted into an attack surface. And I do believe that I deserve a medal for this image that took all these connections and transformed them into a web, which is, of course, has to do with Scattered Spider. Now, what Scattered Spider do? Okay, they basically operate. They live on this. They live on this spider web, and their modus operandi is almost always the same. You get initial access. Okay, Nick, you covered that. Once you've done that, you strive to compromise some infrastructure component. In this diagram, it's domain control. It could have been the workload infrastructure. It could have been the SaaS, whatever. Again, initial access by definition is opportunistic, right? You target the weakest link, and then in the lack of a better term, so I will baptize the term vertical movement, right? We have lateral movement, which is like cross from machine to machine, from resource to resource. We have vertical movement that actually is from the cloud to the on-prem and back. And from the security aspect, I think this is the most fascinating thing about the Scattered Spider. They're preferred. I don't know if they're preferred, but the documented infrastructure that Scattered Spider go after is Okta and Azure AD. When we're talking about SaaS identity providers, and this of course gives them unlimited access to SaaS applications. Apparently they also have a fund for CyberArk and extracting privileged credentials to access resources all across the environment, from VMs in Azure to on-prem databases. They've been also documented to go after the vCenter infrastructure, not only to access VMs, but also to create new VMs, join them to the group of legitimate VMs, and then make their way around. And Nick, as you said, and we're talking about the IaaS, it's AWS System Manager Inventory and Azure Serial Console, from both of which they can get almost unlimited access to the workloads that exist in the environment's cloud infrastructure. Just as a teaser, okay, so yeah, we all remember MGM. I think there's no one who doesn't rejoice at least a bit when he hears about a casino that gets hacked. Apparently, there is some kind of political justice in this world. What happened there was actually very interesting. It's if we'll try to sort of track the route that the Scattered Spider group has taken here. So initially, they started, again, as always, with credential compromise, but it was of an on-prem workstation. These were VPN credentials, okay? Then they made their way into the DC. That was the lateral movement infrastructure. That was the identity infrastructure that they've targeted. Then they searched the Okta sync server, and Yaron will deep dive into the purpose of that in a minute. And next step was to gain full control on Okta with unlimited access to the SaaS applications. So with this, I want to pass it to Yaron. It will give us the drill down into why they did that and what did they gain.
Yeah.
So so the attackers here they had access to the domain controllers. To the domain controllers, in essence, it's the core of the Active Directory infrastructure. And from there, it should be pretty easy to already achieve control of a lot of stuff in the organization, right? At least everything that's on-prem, because when you have access to the domain controller, you not only have access to managing computers using group policy, but the domain controller also keeps a database of password hashes for every user and computer in the environment, right? So if you reach the domain controller, you can just take those password hashes and dump them, and then you have a password hash for every user. And those hashes can be used directly to move laterally in the on-prem environment, right? It's called pass the hash. You take the hash and you use it to access any other computers, and that's useful. But what happens if you want to access a cloud environment or let's say a SaaS application with that same password hash? You can't just take the password hash and use it to access a cloud application. What happens a lot of times, sometimes you can, but in a lot of cases, the cloud identity provider will authenticate the user with a different protocol that doesn't use the password hash, but uses the password. So if you want to compromise that user and actually use the stolen password hash to access a cloud application, what you need to do is to get the actual password from the hash. So for that, you could run a brute force attack or use rainbow tables to obtain the passwords from the hashes. And that's a useful technique, especially for the weaker passwords, right? If somebody has a weak password, it should be pretty easy to take a password hash for an empty hash from the domain controller and get the password from it. So that works well. But then what do you do with the strong passwords? With strong passwords, you might not be able to break the password from the password hash, and then the attacker needs to do something else. So this is a statement by an affiliate of Scattered Spider that was put online by this Brad Callow. Brad Callow is not with the affiliate. He just put this quote on Twitter. So what they said was, here's what they said. They said MGM made the hasty decision to shut down each and every one of the Okta Sync servers after learning that we have been lurking on their Okta agent servers, sniffing passwords of people whose password couldn't be cracked from their domain controller hash dumps. So what we can understand from this is that they couldn't crack all the passwords by stealing the hashes and then just using grade mode tables. They needed something else. And what they did was something very smart. They went from the domain controllers to the Okta servers where the Okta agents were installed. And then from there, they were able to sniff the passwords of those people that were using the stronger password.
So basically, keep all of this in mind, because this is definitely what we had in mind when we came to respond at our customer. So basically, what we have here, I mean, these are very good general advice, right? I mean, but actually looking at it now, it seems generic and very similar to the advice for good life that you have on the back of cereal boxes. But let's try to translate that into what you want to achieve. If you want to do an efficient identity incident response, okay, and capture compromised user, we must be able to discover all the compromised user. Here I have a typo, and I had a typo. Okay, two typos. Okay, we need, after we detect them, we need to immediately contain them to ensure that there is no further malicious access is carried out. which we can refer later as identity lockdown, and we need to recover. Okay, we need to reset the password to compromised users. We need to quarantine the machine and take them back. Now, in terms of the user experience, so let's assume, okay, you got an alert, right? The status says that malicious presence in the network has been either suspected or validated. If you're lucky, the security team has just caught up an alert and made the good decision to go into emergency mode. And in the bad case, your servers are already shut down and encrypted. Now, your mission is identify compromised user accounts and compromised user accounts and resources. And to execute that, and this is what we're about to show you, we need to place a protection layer that both prevents further malicious access and also discloses the attacker. So think about it like as if you wrap each resource with this layer. Now, and you put policies in place to block any anomalous or malicious access. Now, the minute such an access is attempted, for example, from the workstation to the workload infrastructure, okay, A, it's blocked. B, you know for sure that the account that initiated this is compromised, and also you know that this machine is compromised. Okay, so you got the strongest indications possible, and in this is what we're using Silverfort platform for. And in a nutshell, this is the identity infrastructure. Silverfort has a core that sort of wraps up, integrates with all these components, gets real-time visibility, analysis, enforcement to any authentication that takes place within the environment. And with this technology, we're able to do MFA across the board, discover and protect service accounts, establish identity firewalls rules, and of course, ITDR, identity threat detection response, detect threats in the network. Now, all these capabilities are used in conjunction in our in an incident response process. So here we are
real quick.
Yes.
I want to interject a question that was back, I think back a slide at least. John was asking, you'd made a comment about what's being passed between the Okta agent to Okta, and he's asking, are you saying that the Okta agent is sending passwords from on-prem to Okta and not the hash?
So it's actually happening. This was not the sync capabilities from the Okta agent. By the way, I don't know exactly what happened there. I can only know what happens from what the attacker published. But it sounds like in this case they were using the capability of the Okta agent to authenticate users in the cloud. So actually somebody accesses a cloud application, then the cloud application redirects the user to Okta, then the user tries to access Okta. But the way it's configured is that whenever you enter your username and password in Okta, it reaches out to the Okta agent that's actually on-prem, and then that Okta agent is using LDAP or any other protocol to check that, to verify the password with Active Directory. So I think in this scenario, the Okta agent actually gets the plain text password of the user, so it can use it to check the password against the Active Directory. And I understand, but that's the mode that they've been using, because the attackers said that they were lurking on users' passwords when they were authenticating to Okta. So what I understand is that they were not stealing all of the hashes that were synced to Okta. They were just waiting for users to authenticate, and then just took the plain text passwords from the Okta agent during the authentication.
Yeah, so it's important. It's important because I won't assume that Okta in any circumstance actually stores clear text passwords on the server. Clearly, it was through in the course of the authentication process.
That's all we've got. Keep going.
Okay, cool. So in the beginning, what was the status when we came in? First of all, in terms of infrastructure. So we had Active Directory, we had with Active Directory on-prem and also PAM. We had an ADFS server. There were actually both Azure AD and Okta as in the SaaS environment, and we had Azure as the main IaaS provider. When we were called in, okay, it was in a stage where the identity infrastructure was already partially compromised. Okay, I think it was the PAM, not sure, but it was it was almost like validated for a fact that the attackers are inside, that the attackers has obtained access to a piece of infrastructure that gave them gave them free access to privileged usernames and passwords. Okay, there was actually a very high-profile third-party IR firm that were already engaged. I can't say the name. And at that point, that was where speed mattered most. Okay, and this when we started to and then this is where things got interesting. So where's the attacker? No visibility. Need to get it as soon as possible. Now this is where we start to use our platform to rapidly respond and dramatically accelerate the time required to do so. So Yaron, as the one leading it, so share with us.
So when we're in this a situation like this, there are things that to look for that happen in a lot of attacks, and these are things that happen usually during these advanced stages of the attack. So in early stages of the attacks, we might not be able to see these kinds of things because the attacker is trying to move slowly until they reach the identity infrastructure. But once they reach the identity infrastructure, which is really not the situation, the ideal situation to start an incident response in, then we might see much more large-scale activity, and these are actually easier to spot. So we're looking for some of these patterns, and in this case, we did find almost all these patterns. So we saw excessive activity by users, accounts that were enabled, the existing accounts that were previously disabled, but now they're suddenly enabled, or new accounts that are created. We're looking for automated activity, something that doesn't look like a human activity of someone just accessing a computer, then an application or two, something that's much more repetitive and large scale. We're looking for authentication that's being denied. Sometimes even if the attacker has a foothold of the identity infrastructure, not all the authentication will be approved. They'll try stuff that won't work. Then we're also looking for compromised endpoints and things we know from other security products to get these leads and search there more, search there to see what else was happening on that endpoint. Where was the endpoint? What was the endpoint accessing? And then we're chasing the threat, right? We find a lead, we find a user or an endpoint that we understand the attacker was using, and then we see what other users are related, what other computers are related, and we chase the threat using that. And of course, things like malicious IP addresses and bad geolocations are things that are very indicative of an attack.
Okay, so what we see here, this is Silverfort's logs. Okay, and this is where we take the logs of all authentication that takes place on-prem and in the cloud. Okay, naturally, when you come to respond, this is the first place that you look. Okay, it has various filters, and it can, in this case, for example, so what are we seeing here?
Yeah, so on the left we can see just a graph of risky authentication over time. So the overall number of authentications might not grow in these situations because maybe it's a very active organization where users are authenticating a lot. But we will see more risky authentications, right? So since we we are giving a score for every authentication based on anomalies and known TTPs. We can track the number of risky authentications, and then we can just based on that, we see that something is happening.
Mm-hmm. Oh. In this case, by the way, we can see that the account is repeatedly trying to access resources and it gets denied is a service account. Okay, now the service account, as we all know, these are they're machine-to-machine account. Attackers love them because they're highly privileged and usually unknown, unmonitored, and you can't protect them with MFA. So apparently, what happened here is the attacker tried to take the service account and access some machines. Apparently, at least in this batch, okay, these are machines that the service accounts didn't have access to. But again, that was a clear indication that this service account this specific service account is probably compromised. Okay.
Another thing we're looking for, like I said, is newly created or enabled service account. So we're searching for these here. We're adding a simple filter to see any stale users activity. That's the big picture that you're seeing here. We're looking for these users that were previously disabled. Suddenly they're enabled and they're starting to access all kinds of services and resources in the environment. We're seeing a few denied accesses and then 2 allowed accesses. That's something that should worry us.
Mm-hmm.
We're also seeing the NTLM protocol being used. NTLM is a protocol that's pretty much easy to use for an attacker, because
just for here, we see the NTLM here under the auth type, Active Directory NTLM. I assume some of the audience are not as familiar with the console as we are.
Good point. So yeah, with NTLM, that's something that attackers will often choose to use. I mentioned earlier that sometimes they'll take the hashes of the password, the NTLM hashes of the user passwords, and with the NTLM protocol, they can simply use these hashes to authenticate to anything. So it's an easy protocol to use. They won't necessarily go for it. They can also use Kerberos or any other authentication protocol. Once they have the credentials, they can simply use it. But NTLM is a preferred protocol for attackers, so also something to look into.
Yeah, so it's also important to know that Scarlet Spider, like many other attack groups, apparently they rather they would rather go after the accounts that are prone to draw the least attention. Okay, so they will they'll stay in the environment. They will look, for example, for an account that doesn't move, doesn't log anywhere. Okay, it could be, by the way, an account of an employee that has left about 6 months ago and is now exempt from any access policies. And also, there's a thing, I don't remember, Nick, if we've mentioned that when we talked about the MITRE, but also like creating a new account, given that you can do that silently, this is also, in a way, the ultimate weapon, because this new account will definitely not be subject to any protection which you might have on the environment. So just want to say this: what you see here, you can see that the auth type is Active Directory and protocols NTLM. Okay, because this is the example. But this log table at the same manner also shows anything that takes place in Okta, everything that takes place in Azure AD, or any other directory or directory authentication or access attempts that takes place in the environment. Now, next we're looking on automated activity. So, Yaron, can you elaborate on that? So what are we seeing here on the screen?
Yeah, of course. So here we're seeing some. This is the service account screen of Silverfort, and here we're seeing things that were detected as service accounts or machine-to-machine activity. And this, I'm only showing here 2 of the 166 machine-to-machine user accounts that were identified in this environment. But I was looking at accounts that were doing a lot of authentication. Now, it's important to say that in any environment, there's going to be a lot of legitimate machine-to-machine activity. But we're looking for activity that's anomalous or accounts that are not well-known service accounts. If there's a service account that's doing a lot of authentications in the environment, usually the IT team should know them, right? But if it's an unknown service account, that's something to look into. And in this case, we have been able to identify for our customer a service account that was used by the attackers, but they didn't know, and they were just using them to move laterally.
Yeah, just want to say before, so I think the one good thing you can say about service accounts is that they're predictable, right? Because if as an IT admin configuring a service account to log in with a script every 48 hours and to do something, I don't know, health check or monitoring, so it's actually much easier to detect the behavioral deviation of a service account is a much clearer indication of compromise than with human user. And this actually is what you see now. And when this service accounts repeatedly attempts to access destinations that it never accessed before, like it happened in this attack, this is a clear indication that that the service account is compromised. Now, so far what we showed is I would say, and is the sort of investigation and detection, that in immediate scoping of okay, where do we see anomalies, okay, and how can we detect malicious activity based on the logs that we've seen, okay. Now this is important, but in parallel, what also happened, and I think this is think of it, you have a fire in the house, right? So you call the firefighters, right? But okay, but until they come, so I don't know, you have a hose or you have buckets of water, you need to somehow contain what's happening. You need to make sure that the fire, even if you can't if you can't take it off, at least doesn't spread across the entire house. So in here it becomes actually very interesting, because with Silverfort we're able to actually place roadblocks that will block any additional lateral movement, okay, and disclose them. So this is what we see here. This is our MFA policy scheme, okay. Given due to our architecture and technology, we can enforce MFA across every protocol from SAML to LDAP and NTLM and Kerberos, okay. So Yaron, can you explain what we've done here and what we found?
Yeah. So what our customer did here, which was very important, is to first make sure that they have access. They need administrative access to take care of the event, but they don't want it to be too broad so that it won't be used by the attacker. So what they were able to do is to select a small number of admins that will have a highly privileged access, and then secure the access for these admins. So here, what they did was first create a very broad MFA rule for them, right? Anything that these admins are accessing need MFA. It's a simple rule, and it might be a bit much for a regular user, but for these admins that are handling this attack, it's a very important rule. Of course, they need to make sure that they have strong password for these users. They require MFA everywhere, and then for the rest of the admins, usually they won't have only a handful of admins in the environment. Usually, organizations have much more than that. They restrict the access. They remove rights or disable the accounts completely. This way, they make sure that only they have administrative access to the domain.
Mm-hmm. And take note, by the way, that once this policy is in place, whenever this is actually one of the ultimate ways to discover and to detect who from the existing domain admins is compromised, right? Because what happens now is, and of course we can definitely at a certain point we can expand for everyone, but as soon as you put this policy in place, whenever you get a denied MFA, this actually provides you with the ultimate indication of compromise, right? And this is actually much more efficient than try to hunt down anomalies. If there's anything, I think if there's, I don't know many things that are more ungrateful and time-consuming than to deduce what kind of an anomaly indicates compromise or what is just part of the standard behavior, right? Because humans are unpredictable. But once you're able to place MFA on every authentication to every resource, this, I think, in that case, it didn't take more than 2 hours to yield us who the compromised users are. Okay, once we had this knowledge, everything really became much easier.
Yeah. So now you have these admins, and you added MFA. Okay. So that's a good way to restrict the access. But then you really don't need to access everything, right, with these admins. So you can go ahead and restrict that further. Maybe these admins only need access to the security tools, to the domain controllers, and certain admin workstation. So allow that access, then deny anything else. Now you're good to go. If you need anything else, you can extend that policy later. You don't need to do it now. If they need additional access, you can always add that. But at least you locked down the access for these admins, so they will only be able to do what they need to do. So even if the attacker manages to get the credentials of one of these admins, they're not able to do much.
Okay, and again, following that, this what we see here. This is a cutoff of the report generation. At this stage of the incident response, okay, I think we already had users that we know that were compromised, but again, since the process of eradication of malicious presence was just beginning, we assumed that there is still a malicious activity that we might have not detected, and we said, okay, which users are at risk maybe for being being compromised later on. So we took all of these users, the ones that we know that's been targeted, and the ones that were privileged enough and wanted to take care of them, and then we've configured a custom report of all of their activity to be generated. Here it was daily. I think it's actually you can configure it to be even more granular than that, and in that way you have both the roadblocks, the actual the actual hedges that prevent the attacker from spreading forward, and what we have while in the meantime we're continuously aggregating all the activity and reporting it to the security team that can take that and feed that into their operation. And again, following that was probably some deeper investigation. Right on.
Yeah. So once, if we find a user that's compromised, what we do is we start following what it was doing. What computers was the user operating on? Did we find a list of computers that it was operating on? Now all these computers are suspected as compromised. So now we go to each of these computers and we see what other users will use on these computers. What other anomalous activity we can see on these computers. Based on that, we increase the numbers of users that we suspect. And at this point, we can be pretty good on disabling these users, right? Mm-hmm. We want to be extra careful so these users won't be used by an attacker. So even if we just suspect the user might have been compromised, we could disable the user or change the password. Just make sure that there's no traces for the attacker to continue its attack.
And by the way, again, just a segue to this side, that we need to remember that there are times in instant response that it's an emergency, right? It's like, you know, I don't know what's the best metaphor. It could be a burning fire. It could be, I don't know, blood running out of the vein. The point is that there is a time where you have to take steps in a volume and force that you would never have done under regular circumstances. And I think one of the few times that justify this type of no more Mr. Nice Guy is exactly that time, when you know you have a user in the network. Because remember, even one compromised user, in theory, is capable of, if it's privileged enough, is capable of, you don't need more than 2 seconds, okay? If you own a domain controller, so what, you find the shift folder, load your script, then you can encrypt thousands of machines in mere seconds. And this is why the usual trade-off that you have between, keeping your employees happy and 1 minute, if you believe that my computer nearly ran out of battery. Okay, so the usual balance that you strive to maintain simply does not apply now. Okay, so this is so Yaron will walk you through all of these mega roadblocks that we've put in this process and what we got from it.
Yeah, before you jump on, there's a couple of questions I want to interject if I can. You had talked about restrictions a couple of slides back here, and Werner asked, can restrictions be put in place for specific accounts with a specific time restriction? And Werner gives an example of service accounts that only run from, let's say, X hour to Y hour, from like 3 in the morning to 5 in the morning, kind of a thing. Can you put a restriction in place for that?
Yes, so it can be based on several things. One of the most effective types of restrictions that we're doing is actually based on source. A lot of times there's going to be a service account that's operating from a certain server. If they're accessing from any other server, then we can just block that authentication. That is something that applies to a lot of service accounts, and it's something that's easy to enforce because it won't block any of the legitimate activity of the service, but it's really restricting what an attacker can do after they got the credential of that service account. Also, like you said, time of days, any anomalous activities that the attacker is trying to use, specific resources that the account should be accessing and resources that they shouldn't be accessing. So we take into account many parameters, and since this might be a bit difficult for our customer to understand for each account exactly what these parameters are, we have an automated process of doing it. So we identify these patterns automatically.
Excellent. Then a couple other questions came in. Carson said, sorry if you've covered this earlier. Was Silverfort software installed prior to the incident at the customer site, or was it installed during your incident response?
So this is such a great question. So the answer, the cool answer, is that we were installed, but on a very small scale. So it was already a customer, okay, but we were installed, I think, only on maybe 1 or 2 domain controller out of his 30 or 40. Once the customer realized that they're under attack, so he immediately asked us, guys, can you come lend a hand? And then we sort of immediately applied a speed deployment process. I think within 12 hours we covered his entire environment. Okay, and basically all the things that we've shown you now, I think were already up and running. Most of them were up and running, I think, after 6 hours. I think this was actually quite fascinating, because we've done incident response before in customers where we were full deployed, but that was actually the first time that we've experienced such rapid deployment that can really that was required in this type of emergency.
And then John's got a question. So I know an agent goes on each DC. So, and I'm reading from the rest of the question, I think John's implying. So I get how Active Directory is protected. So how does it protect Azure IDP and role activation?
How it protects Azure IDP? Is that a question?
Yeah, Azure IDP, yeah.
Yeah, so with Azure IDP, we have multiple ways to protect it. First of all, we monitor all the authentication traffic in Azure AD, Entra ID it's called now. So we monitor all of the authentication there, and we identify anomalies. We identify threats based on the authentication there, just as we do on-prem. We're also able to correlate that activity with what's happening on-prem. So usually it's going to be the same users accessing Active Directory, Azure AD, and any of the other identity infrastructure of the organization, and we're able to correlate that and take that into account when making decisions.
Yeah, I think also I'm not a mind reader, but maybe this question also referred to, okay, the Active DC, we have an agent that sends data. How does, for example, Azure AD or Okta, how do they share send data to Silverfort?
Mm-hmm. So we have integrations with each of these identity providers based on APIs that they share with partners to have to get that information. The other way that we protect these identity providers is with actual real-time enforcement. So if there's an authentication that's being in authentication in Azure AD, we can be that MFA provider that will block that Azure AD, and that can happen both based on risk as well.
And then John had one other question, actually more commentary, and this is maybe for Azure during the rest of your presentation. John's asking if you would highlight, he says the MFA of command line. Not sure, I didn't hear you mention something about that, but also the fencing of service accounts and systems. So as you're going through this, if you can touch on that, that'd be great.
Cool. So I can only assume that John probably meant to ask whether we can enforce MFA on command line access, which this is
probably, yeah.
I assume. So if the question was if, the answer is yes. If the question is how, so again, because Active Directory forwards us every access of every authentication and waits for Silverfort's verdict prior to enabling access or denying it, it basically enables us to analyze the packet, analyze the authentication attempt, and trigger trigger MFA through our cloud service if needed, okay, regardless of the protocol in which this authentication was initially executed on. So it doesn't matter if it's NTLM or Kerberos or whatever, as long as it's against Active Directory will forward us the authentication, and then we'll be we'll be able to apply MFA if necessary. I really hope that answered the question.
And that's all we've got. Oh, actually, wait, there's one more came in. Take that back, Stephen. So which MFA solution is most recommended? And is there an, if it's an app, which one? Do you guys have any recommendations? Or maybe if nothing else, can you talk about which ones you integrate with?
If you were a bit cut off. So the question was about MFA solution, which one we recommend?
Yeah, he was saying which MFA solutions, which obviously you're talking about your own in a way. So can you talk a little bit about MFA solutions and how this all works together and maybe what recommendations you have?
So actually, well, we definitely like our own MFA, but no, the truth is,
of course you do.
the truth is that since we're grown-ups and we understand that our point of view is rather subjective, and our customers, usually most of them have already their own MFA, RSA, Duo, Azure, Okta, Ping, whatever. So we actually built integration with all of the main MFA providers. So in that way, you don't even have to use our MFA app. if, for example, you use Duo in your environment, you can install Silverfort, and you'll just use Silverfort as the sort of the back-end engine that enables you to extend Duo protection to all the places that Duo or other traditional MFAs traditionally cannot protect. For example, authentications that take place over Kerberos or NTLM.
Yeah, I would just add that I don't think we have a specific vendor that we'd recommend, but in terms of methods, there are methods for MFA that are much better than others. For example, if you use phishing-resistant MFA methods based on FIDO2 standards, or if you use things like number matching for MFA, then you're able to avoid some of these attacks that you mentioned earlier, Nick, these MFA push bombing techniques. There are certain MFA techniques that are simply immune to this type of attack. And these are the methods that we usually recommend to our customers. It's not always easy to use them in every case, but where possible, they do provide the better security.
Excellent. I think now we have all our questions answered for the moment.
Okay, cool.
Perfect. So now we want to lock down the environment. We want to make sure that the attacker is not able to. They have many users. We want to make sure that the attacker doesn't get everywhere. So you want to operate here in several fronts. Of course, you want to lock down the network, but then even if you lock the attacker down at the network level, it's usually very hard to do it while also blocking east-west traffic within network segment. Blocking outbound traffic is not always enough. You want to use all the capabilities that the endpoint protection tools you have. You have for also quarantining the attacker, but you won't always have know exactly in which endpoints they are. They will not always use managed endpoints. So it's not a complete solution. It's important, but it's not a complete solution. And I think one of the cool things that I've seen here is our customer utilize our ability to do a full-scale identity lockdown. What they said was, instead of blocking access at the network level, instead of blocking it at the endpoint level, let's block it at the identity level. Let's block the attacker from authenticating. Now, usually in normal situations, I really need to convince a customer to start using these deny policy, this wide deny policy. But here, the customer was actually volunteering these policies, which was pretty nice. So here's a few examples. You have a VPN. Do your service accounts need access to your VPN? No, just block it, right? Use the policy, don't block it. What about NTLM? We've said, but it's been used by attacker. You can block all NTLM in the environment. It's a rather extreme step to do, but it's an extreme situation. So in this case, it was suitable.
Just want to make sure to understand what we're saying. Okay, so in this policy, we take authentication type as Active Directory, and we choose, we check the NTLM box, and basically we say from that point on, NTLM traffic is no longer allowed in the environment. Now again, this is really important, because again, as anyone who dealt with pass the hash, with password movement himself or herself knows, basically using NTLM authentication through NTLM is literally handing out your passwords to attackers on Silvertrade. And when you know for sure that you have attackers in the network, this is exactly the type of attack surface you really want to mitigate at once. Now, will you be able to carry out this secure policy in real life afterwards? Maybe yes, maybe not. The beauty here is that you can do that. You can start again. You can block anything, and then you can start releasing, one by one, group by group. Do it in a controlled and monitored manner. Okay, and this is also a unique capability that you can literally cannot do with any with any other product. Okay, this is, by the way, this is the policy screen for the service accounts. So we have the service accounts here that we've met that we've met before. Now every service account is Silverfort creates a policy based on its behavior that basically says these are the standard sources, these are the standard destinations, these are the protocols. Allow this always, and otherwise either block, alert, or block access, or send alert to C. Now, that goes without saying that in this case, we can use that. And can you explain the concept of scanner accounts?
Yeah, so we all have these, right? It's accounts that are used to scan all kinds of computers, maybe for security purposes, maybe for backup purposes, configuration management, and these are actually very common. And some are not implemented as safely as others. Some just leave their credentials laying around on every computer in the environment, and then the attacker just needs to lurk on one computer, wait for that service account to connect, then they can connect anywhere. So it's very important to restrict access for these accounts to only operate from their usual source. Built-in administrator accounts, for some reason, attackers love activating them. So here it was already disabled in AD. We told our customer, just block it anyway. Add a policy to block it, even if it's disabled and can't be used right now by the attacker. If the attacker somehow gets access to the AD, they will you're able to block it even before the user actually exists, in the sense that it can be used for authentication.
Yeah. And this is also something that actually took place in this attack. I think there were several built-in administrator accounts that were enabled. So basically, following all that we've done now, all of these steps, both the investigation, both the proactive blocking, all of them actually. Once we've done this, and this, I think here we describe the phase that we were, after this initial, 12 hours, 13 hours. In a way, I think what turned it to be most of the compromised user accounts were already discovered and reset by this at this stage. Now now there was time to, okay, we've done the big thing. Danger, immediate danger is away. Okay, now we can roll out some other activities to really ensure that all malicious presence was indeed detected and removed. So, Yaron, can you walk us through this through what we've done now?
Of course, yeah. So now there's access. There's things are blocked. Now we can start monitoring, doing some more complicated investigation, like looking at doing risk-based authentication, doing MFA when we detect certain types of risks. We can add MFA to all privileged access to make sure that any privileged access is covered with MFA. So if some of these access may have been blocked before, and now gradually we're starting to release access and allow that access, but for any of these access that we do allow, we want multi-factor authentication, of course. We're also monitoring for any attempts to use compromised users. What we often see in these attacks is that the attacker's compromised user, some of these users have been disabled in Active Directory, but the attacker will try to use them because they think they have the password and they should be able to use that. So this is something that's very good to monitor for, because then you can find where the attacker is operating from. You can find additional endpoints that are compromised, and then you can handle them with your endpoint protection. You can do a double reset to TGT if you suspect your Active Directory might have been compromised. That protects you against some domain compromise attacks such as a golden ticket, and investigate all the leads that you found. This is a longer process, but it's important to complete it to reach the attacker and make sure that there's no traces of it in your environment.
Mm-hmm. And that's all. Any additional questions?
There are a couple. So I just want to note, everyone, we know we're at the bottom of the hour. There's a couple that are coming here, so I do want to try to address them. So you're welcome to stand with us, but if you have to drop off, we totally understand. John asks, once the breach was discovered, how long before the organization, so I have to see the rest of it, was able to safely resume operations?
I think it was around from the time that they took us in. I think it was around 3 to 4 days after they took all necessary precautions.
Okay, perfect. And then Stephen wants to know, does Silverfort support zero trust architecture?
Of course, actually, Silverfort, no, zero trust is actually, let's be fair. Zero trust is a very over-inclusive term, right? It relates to, as a networking aspect, that from Silverfort side, we definitely enable you to implement the zero trust approach through the identity aspect. Okay, so basically you can actually with Silverfort enforce risk-based policies on all of your users, ensuring that no user is that no user gets implicit trust, and no user can access the resource prior to further validation. It's up to you how strong this validation would be. Okay, you can enforce MFA all the time. You can enforce MFA only when a risk is detected. But the short answer, yeah, definitely. I think most of our big enterprise customers, they definitely view us as a critical component in their zero trust strategy.
Yeah, that's a great commentary. Just zero trust is as a goal. It's a concept. It does have certain tenets. NIST has an entire document on it that sort of outline at least generally how it's perceived. But then you talk to any vendor and they'll start showing their own sort of ways to think that zero trust can be implemented. But you're 100% spot on. And there's one other question that came in early on from Melvin that I wanted to answer, because that was sort of interesting. Melvin says, well, the MITRE framework is focused on this session. Melvin asks, is the NIST CSF, equally prepared to position to address scattered spider attacks? And so I'm going to address it this way. Melvin, the NIST CSF is a way of sort of how you would organize your thinking about how you would approach establishing a cybersecurity strategy. When you start digging down into CSF, you'll see when they get to very specific aspects of it, the references are other frameworks. So CSF is more of like a culmination of many frameworks that NIST has put together to establish, okay, this is the way that you should think about organizing your cybersecurity strategy. MITRE, in contrast, in complete contrast, has nothing to do with setting up your cybersecurity strategy, although there's an application for it towards making your cybersecurity strategy better. The MITRE Tech framework is purely about categorizing and organizing threat actions into a way that's very concise, very organized in tactics, techniques, and then procedures. Tactics being high-level goals like lateral movement, techniques being very specific things that they're doing, like let's say using a remote access tool to laterally move, and then procedures would be examples of very specific groups doing it exactly this specific way laid out. This is how they did it. And so the way that helps make your cybersecurity strategy stronger is you understand, one, where solutions like Silverfort's, how they apply and which parts of the attack surface, which part of the attack actions they will help stop or thwart or slow down or mitigate, as the case would be. And then also you get a sense of what are bad guys doing, and therefore what should I be trying to strengthen within my own cybersecurity strategy. So I hope that answers your question. And with that, we're about 3 minutes past the bottom of the hour. A bunch of you have stayed on, so really appreciate you staying on to the bitter end. Do want to thank the folks at Silverfort for sponsoring today's real training for free. Yiftach, Yaron, thank you very much for a great presentation back and forth. There was even a thank you for the color commentary on NTLM. I saw a nice. I saw saying thanks for the down-to-earth and practical advice. Thanks for this great stuff. So lots of good feedback from our audience, guys. Appreciate you both being here. And with that, we're going to conclude today's webcast. Thanks a lot for attending, and we'll catch you on the next one.